Hello and welcome. I'm excited that we have hundreds of folks in this space with us, and I think it's indicative of how important this conversation is, and it's something we recognize that bringing connections to students, especially in this time, is essential. As an opening sort of systems check, I'd like to invite everyone who's watching to comment in the chat with the city where you are, and again, with an optimistic lens, a couple of words about something that you're looking forward to when we are all out and about again. And as part of that systems check, I want to also draw your attention to the fact that there's a Q&A box. The Q&A box is for questions that will go to our panelists today. The chat box is for open discussion, and we're welcoming whatever thoughts or notions you have that you want to put in there. It's part of making this a rich learning experience. This webinar is meant to be a resource, and it's not the end of this dialogue. We're developing guidance for policymakers and for district leaders, so feel free to share ideas or questions or resources that you think the field should consider. So again, for group discussion, that should be in the chat, and if you have things that you'd like to direct to the panelists, put that in the Q&A box. Just as a process point, I'm sure that everybody and their sister has been in multiple video conference meetings. This, however, is our first time hosting a large-scale webinar, so I'll ask for some grace as we get oriented to this new format. And if there are any technical glitches along the way, please bear with us. It'll be worth it because we have some great minds in the room today. And on that note, let's talk about why we're here. It's a central part of our agenda for the Aspen and Education Society program that we engage with districts and policymakers about how we integrate the science of learning and development into systems and policy. We see national attention to the remarkable and Herculean effort that school districts are doing right now in terms of feeding families, getting devices out, propping up distance learning. And at the same time, when we talk to district leaders, when we talk to families, we're hearing that this isn't all that families are looking for. In fact, personal connectedness, social connections, coping resources are just as important, if not more so, than devices and meals. Of course, this makes complete sense with what we know from research in psychology. Food and safety are at the foundations of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And at the same time, we have to remember that relationships are next in line in that hierarchy. Validating, nurturing connections are essential to equitable outcomes, especially for kids that society has placed at the margins. We all share the responsibility for embracing every student with care so that they can thrive academically and otherwise. So with that in mind, we have an impressive set of leaders with a variety of perspectives here, all sharing commitment to creating healthy space for kids and adults. So I'm going to invite the panelists to introduce themselves. And we'll start off with Patty.
Hi, everyone. I'm Patty Salzman, and I serve as the Chief Academic Officer for San Antonio ISD.
And Patty, can you share with us one thing you're looking forward to when we're all back out in the sun?
You know, I'm looking forward to giving a lot of hugs. I hope that time comes soon because I think we're all craving that human connection.
Thanks, Patty. David?
Hello, Gene. My name is David Adams. I am the Director of Social and Emotional Learning at the Urban Assembly. I am looking back to roasting people with my jump shot on the court. There's been some controversy around this, but let me let you know that even in quarantine, I am developing my ability to be on the next documentary around great basketball players.
Thanks, David. Amanda?
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I'm Amanda Rodriguez. I'm the principal of Clark Pre-K through 8 School in the Cleveland Metropolitan School District in Cleveland, Ohio. And I'm anxiously awaiting, just as one of the other panelists stated, the human touch aspect, just to give my mother a hug, as well as to hear the laughter of children again.
And Natalie.
Hi, Jean. Hi, everybody. Jean, thank you so much for this opportunity. I think this conversation is so important, and I'm really delighted to be here to contribute to it. So I am Natalie Walrand, and I am the director of the Center to Improve Social and Emotional Learning and School Safety at WestEd. The center is funded by the Department of Education. And I am just looking forward to seeing friends and family, getting to travel again, going to restaurants, those sorts of things. Maybe watching Dave play basketball.
Well, that'll settle the controversy. Thank you all for sharing. And that was also a good systems check. So it sounds like everybody's audio and video is great. I want to thank you all for being here and for the work that you do on a day-to-day basis, but especially these days. It is really striking how the responses to what we look forward to are so often rooted in the people that we miss, the social spaces that we miss. And so just as we kick off, Natalie, I'd invite you, if you would, to take us a little bit deeper into some of the research about why this is so important for people and particularly for students.
Absolutely. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. And, you know, as Jean pointed out, I think Jean framed the context so beautifully, right? We are offering this webinar in a moment of crisis. The pandemic has increased our anxiety, our stress, and our fear. And for some of us who may have been living with chronic stress or adversity, the impacts of the pandemic are actually only exacerbating these challenging emotions. And then at the same time, unfortunately, we have limited proximity to many of the people and communities that support us. So I think there's two key points that I really want to emphasize in this webinar. The first is just to affirm that the communities that we love and who love us play an essential role in our well-being and are really critical to our ability to navigate this crisis in a healthy way. And then the second point is that the physical distance doesn't actually have to fracture our relationships. There are strategies that we can employ to ensure that we continue to care for and protect one another, promote the resilience of our loved ones, and provide them with the protective factors against adversity around them. So ready for the next slide. Okay, that is maybe the slide after that. Can you go back one slide? Okay, go back one slide before that one. It should say the headline. Oh, okay, they both say 3 big ideas. Okay, so I think one really wonderful part of today's conversation is that this work is grounded in science, right? And so I wanted to spend a few minutes just talking about what we know from science and how that connects to our practice from the systems level to our classrooms. And so here is the headline. So the headline is safe and supportive relationships promote resilience, provide protective factors, and create the conditions in which every person, regardless of our age, can learn, grow, and thrive. And this statement, I just want to point out, is always true. It's true for every person in every circumstance, with or without a pandemic, but it is especially true in this context. Okay, now I'm ready for the next slide. Sorry about that. Okay, so the science supports 3 big ideas that I think are important to this conversation about relationships in schools, and of course the related concepts of belonging and school connectedness. And I just want to say a few words about these 3 statements. So the first statement is learning happens in relationships. So there's a convergence of evidence from a variety of scientific disciplines about how learning and development happens. We know that learning and brain development involves a continuous interactive process of experimentation and trial and error between a person and their environment. So learning happens when we test new ideas and make connections, which forms and reinforces neural connections and pathways. And our brain synapses and ultimately our brain structure is formed through our experiences. So if you could just go back to the previous slide, thank you. Science tells us that the quality of relationships and environments are significant factors in a child or an adolescent's ability to learn. So children and youth learn, take risks, and achieve at higher levels in safe and supportive conditions and in the care of reliable adults they can trust. So the second sentence here is relationships impact outcomes. And the idea here is that the protective factor benefits of healthy relationships and strong connections are specific and tangible. So regardless of a child's circumstance, childhood and adolescence is an especially vulnerable time of life. The brains of children and youth are especially malleable, meaning that the experiences and the relationships that they have a deep influence on their development. So for this reason, safe, supportive, reliable relationships, you'll hear me saying those words over and over again, safe, supportive, and reliable relationships with children and youth promote their resilience and serve as protective factors against external adversity. And just want to share that a recent study on positive childhood experiences found that having two non-parental adults show a genuine interest in children can offset the effects of adverse experiences, as did feeling supported by friends. And then the final sentence is that relationships in schools matter, right? So next to families, educators have the most impactful, consistent, and potentially close relationships with the children in their care. So this means that as educators, we have a powerful influence on their mental health and their social and emotional well-being. Whether we intend to or not, our relationships with them and their experiences with us influence the way they develop and their ability to learn. And Ross recently shared with me this great study by the CDC that shared that school connectedness, which comes from both relationships and school climate, proved to provide the strongest protective factor for both boys and girls to decrease substance abuse, school absenteeism, early sexual initiation, violence, and risk of unintentional injuries such as drinking, driving, not wearing seatbelts, and so on. So in this same study, school connectedness was also second in importance after family connectedness as a protective factor against emotional distress, disordered eating, and suicidal ideation and attempts. So there you have it, 3 simple statements that describe what the science tells us about the connection between relationships and environments and learning and brain development. So I have one final slide, which is about what this science implies for our practice. So science clearly shows that relationships have a direct and powerful impact on outcomes for children and youth. And so the question then becomes how, right? How do we incorporate the science in the way we serve our communities every day? And how do we do it in this particular moment when we're physically separated from each other, from our students, from their families, and from our own colleagues? And so, the punchline, the big point is relationships are foundational to every aspect of the way we serve children and youth in our schools. And I want to offer these 4 areas. So certainly these aren't all the areas, but just a framework for our conversation today about how we can bolster our relationships in the midst of a pandemic. Okay, so starting at the top, the first circle is educator care. And here I'm referring to how we as educators care for ourselves and care for our colleagues, right? So this is the adult piece. I really want to emphasize that this conversation is not just about relationships between students and adults. So the relationships among the adults and the relationships with ourselves, our own mental health and well-being are important to school environment, climate, and culture. And I have a wonderful colleague at Wested, Jenny Betts, who recently pointed out that our own health and well-being also has intrinsic value, right? So caring for our own needs isn't selfish. And we also say that in order to be able to lead healthy relationships with others, we have to be sure to attend to our own needs. So self-care allows us to model healthy social and emotional competencies for our students. It gives us greater capacity to support them when they need us, and it makes the work sustainable. So just want to acknowledge this is a particularly challenging moment in time for our educators. Distance learning, even when it's occurring online in real time, can feel isolating. And in this crisis, part of our self and collective care routines should include finding opportunities for connecting with our educator colleagues and for embracing our own rituals that we may find to be restorative. So the second circle, just moving clockwise, is school climate. And here we are talking about the work that we can do now to serve as the foundation of our school climate efforts when we return to our school buildings. So the big idea here is safe and supportive school climates are also critical to promoting a sense of connection. And it promotes belonging among all members of a school community. So when students return to school, it's going to feel really essential that the school climate and culture help to bolster a sense of safety and a sense of connection at school. And I wanted to share that my home organization, West Ed, is currently developing a home learning module to the California Healthy Kids Survey Suite. It will ultimately be a suite of surveys for students, staff, and parents. And the primary focus of the survey is on teacher-student and student-student relationships, as well as engagement and motivation. And then the survey will also assess educational outcomes, sleep hygiene, nutrition, physical exercise, family connection, social and emotional health. So really those conditions that our students are experiencing right now. And then just also wanted to point out for this one that there's a lot of overlap here with teacher practice, right? Teacher practice can serve as the basis for fostering relationships and connectedness while students are at home. And educator work now to build and sustain community in a distance learning environment plants the seeds for being able to redouble school climate efforts when students return to school. So the third circle here is about teacher practice. And here, this includes sort of our approach to instruction, the pedagogical choices that we make, as well as our stance as educators. And the big idea here is that when teachers hold high expectations for every child, when we see their strengths and their assets, approach them in a strengths-based way, it promotes their high achievement. Students need to see that their teachers authentically believe in their promise, while also treating them with empathy and compassion. And then finally, the last circle is family engagement, right? I think this is such an important one. It's about how we engage with our families who may be experiencing heightened stress and anxiety right now. And just wanted to share that the strength of our relationships with families and our schools communities are so important, because when educators and families are working together to strengthen children and their communities, the benefits to student outcomes are really compounded. So hopefully that's a useful frame for you all. And I will turn it back over to Eugene. Gene, not Eugene.
Eugene works too. And as a matter of fact, it's worth noting what somebody asked the question that they tuned in late and they weren't sure who was talking. It was actually because I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Gene Pinkard. I'm the Director of Practice and Leadership for the Aspen Institute Education and Society program. And we have a great panel here today, and hopefully you can see all 5 of us on your screen. As a process note again, we welcome folks to share resources or thoughts for the field in the chat. If you have questions specifically for the panelists, please utilize the Q&A box, which you should see on your menu towards the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we will be posting the resources with either a few questions about some of the citations. We'll include those citations when we post the resources after the webinar. Natalie, thank you so much for that summary. There's years and massive amounts of data included in what you so succinctly presented. And it strikes me that that last slide that you shared is sort of a good frame for our conversation. And I'd like to start with David. And David, I'd like to get a sense from you of how you see in the Urban Assembly students and adults navigating this space, particularly around the routines that you've maintained or created for sustaining relationships while we're apart from each other.
Thank you, Gene. And thank you, Natalie. I really appreciated that wonderful overview. I think you really grounded us in some really good science and research that I hopefully can incorporate in some of the things that we talk about in this response. But Gene, thanks for the question, I should say. The Urban Assembly is a collection of 23 schools, a network in New York City where we look to provide innovation in public education. And we do that by supporting schools and supporting their development in a couple of ways. But one of those things is in social and emotional development. And one of the things we think about when we think about a network is we think about bright spot analysis, right? So we really think about who's doing the right thing, how do we know that, and how do we scale it very quickly? And so when we switched over very quickly to this current state of affairs with regards to distance learning, the first thing that a number of our schools did was reconstitute the advisory work. And in our schools, which are mostly high schools and some middle schools, advisory is the kind of focal point by which student-teacher relationships in the school are built. And that didn't come from us. We weren't like, all right, guys, the first thing you need to do is get your advisory. When we did a landscape analysis and we said, okay, what are the needs that people are having? What people said is that we need to recreate this notion of relationships in the context of the virtual space. And then when we looked around our network again, we came up with 3 points that I think are really helpful for this conversation. First is that schools that were the most intentional with regards to the social and emotional development of staff and students had the easiest time transitioning from live space to virtual space. So let me just say that again. The schools who are most intentional about social and emotional development of staff and students had the easiest time transitioning. Not that it was easy, but the easiest. When we did that bright spot analysis, we identified that schools who had really been emphasizing social and emotional development as a core, or one of the core aspects of what they did, were able to transition that relatively effectively. We're going to get back to why in a couple of seconds. Secondly, schools that prioritize the quality of relationships in terms of teacher-student and student-student had the easiest time recreating those relationships online, right? And this is a derivative of the first point, but this is really focused on the notion of relationships as the function of an advisory space in a school, right? So a school who said, I know how to build relationships in real life, I was intentional about that process, was able to make that process intentional. Schools who tried to start virtually building relationships, they've been struggling, they've been working to support them. And then the last thing I want to talk about in terms of this bright spot analysis that we've identified, we talked about schools, we talked about relationships, let's talk about students, is that students who struggled in real life struggled in virtual space, and students who struggled or students who did well in real life, students who did well in real life, yes, did well in virtual space as well. So those are 3 points I just want to take some time to think about. First is I want to talk about this notion of capacity. When schools are focused on social and emotional development, they are building the capacity to build the kinds of relationships that are the types of protective factors that Natalie talked about, right? This capacity is the ability to translate relationships into learning, relationships into sports, relationships into extracurricular activities, relationships into academic achievement. So when you're focused on the social and emotional learning in the overall kind of space, then this translation of this capacity was able to help our students be successful in the virtual space. And we're working now with a lot of districts and schools coming to us and say, this is the first time we've ever thought about relationship building. Can you help us? And of course, the answer is yes. But capacity is important, right? And so the capacity of a school focused on social and emotional learning is a school who is able to translate things in times of crisis. Secondly, let's just talk about why relationships were most developed. Our schools are founded on the notion that you cannot push students if students do not trust you. Their intellectual and cognitive capacities are based on the quality of relationships and trust. If I'm standing on a bridge and I am trusting somebody to say, it's time to jump, that's not because I'm thinking about it, it's because I'm feeling it, right? So these relationships are the basis of the way we push our students to learn, the way we push our students to excel in terms of their cognitive and academic gaps. I visited a charter school in Chicago, Polaris Charter School, who was part of the EL network. And I watched a student push a student to cry on a math problem that she didn't know. And I never forgot what she said. She said, look, this is not about getting it right. We all understand that you're not going to be able to do this on your first try. We've never even learned it. This is about being comfortable with this feeling of struggling, right? And the student was struggling. It wasn't like, they got it the first time. They're really struggling. And that notion of understanding the emotional aspect of learning is something that we need to understand now as we move to distance learning, because it's an emotional thing to have to try and answer questions that you've never seen before without teachers. And then lastly, our students who did well in real life and our students who struggled are the same students. And so we've been really struggling to think about what are the outreach mechanisms that we can use? How do we engage with our families? How do we hang out on TikTok? How do we talk about Instagram? How do we get to our students so that they are not the same students who are struggling all the time, that we have multiple ways of engaging them? So I guess to wrap it up, number one, schools who were intentional made the shift. Relationships that mattered still matter. And students who did well and students who are struggling are the same profile.
Thanks, David. I would love to, Amanda, hear some of your thoughts on that. I've heard you say that at Clark, relationships are your number one priority, and it's led to measurable success there. Just wondering, as a school leader in practice, what does that mean? What do you ask of your team when you say relationships are your number one priority?
Okay, in regards to the area of building relationships, we not only look at the students, but we're also looking at the staff themselves. And that goes beyond just the teachers. We're talking at this point, paraprofessionals, secretarial staff, security staff, and so forth, any educator in the building. And what we're trying to build upon is, just as the other participants have spoken about, we know that we can't move forward in our area of academics until we have those relationships built, not only with our students, but with our community members, as well as the families or caregivers involved. So we placed a great focus on the building of relationships using a lot of different opportunities that have been provided to us. But before we could even move to the students and building those relationships, I had to make sure that my staff was taken care of. And especially during a global pandemic such as this, before we could create a plan to reach the most students, both academically and social and emotionally, I had to make sure my staff was cared for in a way and that they were comfortable. And our district leaders, in the charge of Mr. Gordon, created a list of 5 priorities. And one of those priorities is to continue to support family engagement and communication on a regular basis, to continue with building those relationships as a top priority. So I had to find out exactly where my teachers were at in regards to their own personal lives at this point, with so many things going on with the teachers, many of them having children that they were now responsible for homeschooling themselves, in addition to the 25 to 30 students in a single classroom. So we did a lot of surveying at the district level, reaching out to every educator to find out where they were most comfortable, and using those survey results to create an actual plan for each school. And it was really placed back onto both the union leadership and the school leadership to work together collaboratively to meet our teachers at where they were at, not to add any additional stress, but to make sure that we were still going above and beyond to reach the needs of our families that we serve every day. So looking at that point especially was very important to us.
Amanda, I know you among other leaders in Cleveland and in other cities have actually been identified as essential personnel, so that even when there are restrictions in urban areas, principals are allowed to move around because there's so much more to be done in the community. How have your relationships and the work that you've done previously played into what you're doing now?
That's a very good point to make. So we are fielding phone calls from parents, myself as well, and we are making those or making sure that the needs that are being relayed to us are met, whether it be picking up supplies if they don't have access to technology and delivering them to front doors, maintaining our social distancing. Our district priority is, even though we are an essential worker, we still want to make sure that all of our staff members remain safe. And but reaching out to them in a way that they know that we're there for them. So the teachers are also having office hours on a daily basis at my school. And during that time, the students can call them to just for a simple check-in, or they may work through an academic problem or two. At this time, we're also looking to make sure that some of our most vulnerable children are safe and secure. And just the human connection piece is very important to us. Academics will come, just as David had stated, but first we have to make sure that, number one, the needs are met, but number two, that the children are feeling safe and secure in the environment that they're currently in.
That ties together a couple of things that David mentioned, and I hear you saying. One is that trust is going to be necessary not only to push folks, but that trust is probably important when we're extending helping hands. And we think of some of our families who perhaps haven't had the best experiences with various institutions, that they can trust and have a relationship. And often that's best with schools more than any other institution. It also brings to mind, Natalie, some of the things that you've raised in terms of Amanda's reflection on how important, and I think how smart it was that Cleveland actually surveyed staff. And then we're thinking about students and where they are they okay? And it really gets back to this notion of the information that we need to collect. I'm curious as to you're thinking about that in your work, both generally and right now in such unusual times.
Hi, Jean. Thank you. You know, I think so. The survey piece, from our experience at West Ed, right, is a survey that's specifically about school climate. And I think that what feels really important to us about that survey is that it gathers up a set of nuanced understanding of the experiences of our school communities, so that in some ways we can respond to them now, but in other ways really take an intentional and strategic approach to what school climate looks like when we return to schools, right? And so I think that survey piece is really about providing the foundation for attending to school climate and attending to relationships to some extent now, but then really trying to make the return to school feel a little bit less overwhelming for educators. Is that helpful?
It is helpful. And I'd like to stick on that for a second, because I'm just so impressed with all the work that you guys have done. And I also know that you've seen incredible things in your systems and your districts. Mm-hmm. And that said, I know we don't have all the answers, but how are we going to see how people are doing? How can we do that right now? And let's start with right now, and then think about when we come back, these questions of climate, these questions of wellness, knowing that so much has been disrupted. How do you see people checking in on students in particular in these days?
And Jean, is that question for me, or is that question for?
That's for everybody, but you can take it first if you have something.
I mean, I think that from our vantage point, we're seeing lots of great strategies that are happening. And I almost want to defer to Patty and Amanda and David to talk about what they're doing so we can hear those examples. But there are the things, you know, I think there are things that we are hearing about when in communities that don't necessarily have access to real-time online Zoom meetings, like just simply sending postcards, picking up the phone and calling families, calling students to just check in on them and have quick conversations. And then there have been some really creative opportunities that I've seen as well. So for example, I know of a school that does, that found an online platform for trivia games, and the entire community can join and play trivia games together on a Saturday or Sunday just to bolster that connection. And you can tailor the questions in the trivia. So they're using strategies that are about the school community and the school's history, just to sort of reinforce that connection that each family may have to each other or to the communities or past experiences. So I think, you know, there's a lot of strategies. There's a lot of things that we've been seeing, but I'll stop talking and see what others want to offer.
Jump in, guys.
I'm happy to defer to Patty on this.
You know, I love what Natalie shared about the importance of social emotional learning and how we have to also consider the social emotional learning of our adults. So one of the things that we did early on was, it's one thing to say you need to prioritize social emotional learning, but it's another thing to really codify it. And so we strategically made sure that in our professional development with teachers, that we took the time to develop some touch point space for them. So what we did was we got our best teachers and we created master classes online by level. So if you were a pre-kinder, you went with your pre-kinder buddies. If you were a third grade teacher, you went with your third grade buddies. And we did that to give them a safe space with peers that they knew from their school and from other places, because we felt like if we encourage teachers to prioritize social emotional learning, if they see us modeling it, they'll do the same with their students. We created, and I know many districts have systems where they monitor the number of times students get in their learning programs. We have lots of ways to do that. We have many teachers across the country are using Seesaw or Google Classroom. But in addition to that, our district created what we call a student interaction tracker. And the purpose of that tracker is to ensure that we're not just in general assuming we're making contact with everyone, that we actually know who we made contact with and how we made that contact. And it also prevents situations where you have a counselor, a teacher, maybe the principal reaching out to the same family, because the families are feeling very stressed right now, and we want it to feel like support and not oversight. We want them to feel like we're doing school with them and not to them. And so this student interaction tracker helps us to manage those connections so that we know which families have devices and hotspots, because we know there are issues. You might have the internet, but because you also have people working at home, you don't have enough bandwidth. So we had to first make sure that our kids were fed. We just reached our over 500,000 mark in distributing school lunches. We made sure that our students were connected immediately virtually. So we have an SAISD digital playground where families can go just to play and learn. And then we have our classrooms, because we believe that the best connections for the student are with the teacher. And so then we're managing those environments by ensuring that we're making connections with students. And when we can't, finding out why, and to help them problem solve. So we've worked with the city to help ensure that their electricity is not cut off. We've worked with our transportation so we can put buses in communities for hotspots. So I think in this new environment, we have to think about learning holistically, and where we can try to break down those barriers. And when we do that for families, they see us as being with them and supporting them. There are certainly other things we're doing, but I think that most immediately, I think it's very difficult for our teachers when we say, prioritize SEL. The most important thing we can do is secure our relationships with children, because especially in the online environment, it really depends on them coming to us. It's not like school where they're in your class and they have to be there and they're sitting there and we can control them. In the online environment, it very much depends on them also wanting to be there. And so I think how we ensure that we prioritize an environment of safety and care, and that we have enriching lessons, and that we don't underestimate that for many, many of our teachers, they don't know another system outside of a high stakes accountability system that is very regimented and that has students on a scope and sequence. And when we get too much like that, when we're very regimented with families, I think it stresses them out more. And we know that putting stress on families increases tension in the home. It increases the incidence of child abuse. We know across the country that our domestic violence shelters are seeing an increase. We have a relationship with our San Antonio Police Department where they let us know when students have been involved in some kind of traumatic interaction. That's seen a 50% increase. So what we've really done is try to prioritize being partners with our families and to reduce the stress that we're putting on families in a welcoming and warm way.
There have been a few questions in the Q&A in regard to schools that perhaps, recognizing, David, what you shared early, that if schools have done the work on the front end, have had an easier, not easy, easier transition, but some schools are newer in this space, and recognizing that these relationships, that this safe space needs to be created. So Amanda and David, I'm interested in, where might a school or a system start?
Well, I think Natalie talked a little bit about this, and I'm going to quote some of her concepts here. So the first thing is about consistency and trust, right? So the first thing that a young person looks for a relationship is a consistent interaction. And some of the most challenging environments that our young people live in are challenging because of the inconsistency of those interactions with their caregivers. So the first thing that you can do is make sure that there's a consistent type of way that students and teachers can interact with each other. The second thing that we need to be able to do is work with teachers, and I think Patty talked a little bit about this, but work with teachers to be able to explore the perspective of young people, recognize that there's an emotional component to everything that we do. And so that when we're talking to young people, we need to be able to say things like, I know this is going to be frustrating, but let's work together to get it, to make it happen. We need to recognize, and I think Patty, this is something that's near and dear to my heart. When school systems overburden parents who are not trained educators, and who are often doing their best, who may be ELL learners, who may not have graduated from high school themselves, and then say, this needs to be done because my principal told me it needs to be done, because my superintendent told me it needs to be done, all the way up. But the people who suffer are our kids. So I think we need to, as a whole, kind of really be intentional about the quality of work that we are giving our students and the types of supports that we're offering our parents, so that we don't add another stressor. I mean, Natalie said this so well, and I think I just want to replicate this, is that to me, it's not about avoiding trauma. I mean, I think we should all do that to the best of our ability, but it's about being a protective factor in every kid's life, right? Like, I walk into the day and say, well, who am I being a protective factor? Whose child am I being that resource for, that lifeboat for? Because I am a person who's consistent and predictable and trusting and loving, right? And so when we walk in with those mindsets, when our students are going to be able to benefit, and then our students can use our teachers as those lifeboats to lift them up above their circumstances. So I would just say that when we're transitioning to the online space, the number one thing is to be consistent. Be where you say you're going to be, do what you say you're going to do, and let parents and students know that that's going to be the case. And then secondly, we need to be sure that our students and our parents are interacting with us in ways that support their protective factors. And then lastly, we need to make sure that the work that we're doing is on the level that our parents can support our young people with, rather than being an additional stressor.
Thanks, David. Amanda, I'm curious as to, at Clark or in Cleveland more broadly, your thoughts about where folks might start.
So thinking as of right now, I have a few ideas as when we get back to school, doing things like the conditions for learning survey, finding out exactly where our students are, not making an assumption. I think sometimes as adults, educators or non-educators, we assume we know how the children are feeling and those types of things. So that's on a different end, though. That's upon returning to school.
Amanda, can you say quickly what the Conditions for Learning survey is? Because it's a great tool in Cleveland. And
Sure. So the Conditions for Learning survey is a tool that the district adopted quite a few years ago, and it's given twice, once in the fall and again in the spring, to our students in grades 2 through 8. And using that tool, we measure different categories, such as how the students feel in regards to their safety. And this could include both in the school as well as, for example, walking to and from school, the community safety as well. We also look at the rigor or challenge. How is our staff, or how do our students feel that our staff is setting expectations at a particular level? Then we also look at support. Are there people in the building there providing the children support? And again, this is all from the eyes of the child. And lastly, we do look at the SEL component. We do have a curriculum in grades pre-K through 8, whether it be paths or second step, and do they feel it's making a difference in their lives and their academic success? So that's given twice a year, both fall and spring, and we use that data to drive a lot of conversations, not only amongst ourselves as a leadership team and with our staff, but also with the students. Because again, even when the data is right there in your face, you may not be sure that you're really understanding it until you hear directly from the children. So we do create a panel at our school of the students that have completed the survey, so we get their actual feedback. So we have an understanding of why they answered the question in the way they did, and examples and so forth. So that's what the Conditions for Learning survey is. And we will use that tool again when we return. So we may need to change our practices. Some of those areas may have decreased greatly based on the difference of the regular classroom versus the online learning programs that we're using. So it'll be very interesting to see the data that comes from that. In regards to what we're doing right now and what districts could, or school leaders, I should say, that I'm speaking on, could do is, I think you have to first, as a school administrator, again, look at ourselves as not an educator at this point. Think of yourselves as a parent and what they're going through, as the other panelists have stated. And again, we should not be giving new teaching, in my personal belief, and that of the district, because a lot of our students do not have access, and we're currently working on that as a district, to technology. So we are doing a lot of paper packets as well as supply boxes, getting those delivered out. The county and the district are setting up hotspots, but it's not at 100% yet. And there will be some students that never have accessibility to those tools. So really providing them with information and activities that do not create additional stress on the child, so they can continue to feel successful and not have their self-esteem lowered because they're unsure how to do something because they couldn't log on to the Zoom lesson for that particular day.
That makes a lot of sense. And it makes me think that a lot of what we've been talking about here is related to this notion of conditions for learning, not on a formal instrument, but just recognizing that when we think about the home life of students, the resources that parents have, regardless of their own academic background, all of us are trying to parent and work simultaneously in ways that we haven't had to before. Even in my own home, I would say the conditions for learning are less than optimal at times. And not to make light of it, but we really do need to utilize these routines of checking in, of advisory, of reaching out to families to understand the circumstance in which students are trying to learn, and to keep that information in mind as they come back as well. On a related note, one of the questions that came to us through the chat was this notion of how are there other strategies for when we're coming back to school? How we should think about, I mean, Amanda, I think you nailed it, that we're going to have to check these conditions and check in with students and families when they return. Are there other thoughts that you guys have about the fall, potentially some school systems thinking about summer learning opportunities? How are we going to welcome kids back, build these relationships, make sure that they have the foundation they need to learn? That's an open question.
So our strategy that we're going to be using in San Antonio ISD is to try not to lose connection with them at all. And so we were very fortunate that we were able to provide them with devices and hotspots if needed and work with our city around that. But our intent is to keep them connected. So when school ends at the end of May, they will all be transitioned over to a different digital platform. And we want to make sure that they're continuing to be connected with us, that we offer fun and engaging things. We have always, for the last several years, I don't say always, for the last several years, we've had a Jumpstart program where kids come back with master teachers 10 days before school. And so what we're going to do is expand that program for the purposes of trying to meet the needs of students in smaller groups, to tease out what it is that our students really are needing help with. But I want to go back just to bridge the comment I made about accountability, and that we have teachers, they don't know any other way than high stakes accountability, which for many teachers means there is a certain way of being as a teacher and a certain way of doing things that has an intensity to it. Scope and sequence, standards, assessments. And I think it's up to us as district leaders and building principals to help them understand that during this time of prioritizing the social emotional well-being of students, that it doesn't mean that kids are not going to learn. Even if we say we're going to be more thoughtful about the kinds of learning we engage kids in, we're going to do wonder projects. We're going to take that wonderful PBL that we've been saying for years we would do if we didn't have the pressure of high stakes accountability. We're going to do those kinds of things, and we're going to help parents not be stressed. And we're going to help them understand that what the research says about summer loss, because that's what everyone's worried about. What are we going to do if the kids were out of school for so many months? Is to help students see learning all around them all the time. That learning doesn't have to come from a brick and mortar building. There are a lot of ways that kids can get learning. And that if we can help parents understand that, relieve them of that stress, and help kids see the learning that's all around them all the time, I think that would help teachers too in relieving their level of anxiety around what they perceive perhaps as a lot of loss and kids coming in not on level and things like that.
If I could just follow up with that, Jean, I think this is going to be a time for us to revolutionize the education system and what it means to be educated. I assume there are teachers now who have never experienced teaching and learning outside of the context of either No Child Left Behind or a kind of a focus on testing and criteria as the only way to measure learning. And so what we're going to be seeing now, I think, is this notion of what learning could be. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing how different districts approach this idea. When we look at what people are asking for in the world, they're asking for critical thinkers, they're asking for problem solvers, they're asking for people who can relate to each other and solve problems that are nebulous. When you look at the problem of COVID, you have people who have to solve the problem of how do I keep people engaged with this political situation, and people who are solving the problem of how do I develop a vaccine. They're like really small problems and like really big problems. And we need people across the spectrum who graduate from our schools who can engage in these problems, right? And so I think this is the time for us to come together and say, like, what are we going to do with this, right? What is Patty doing in San Antonio? What is West Ed looking like? What is Chicago looking like? With now that we're looking at this project-based learning, right? There is no accountability. Let's actually do it. Let's actually see what it means in terms of teaching and learning. So I'm just excited for this space. I know that there's a lot of tragedy, and I don't want to waste that tragedy on going back to the same old thing. So I'm excited to see how our educators, how our systems can push our teachers and administrators and our state leaders to think about what this could look like in the future.
Can I just chime in on that as well, Jean? I think that's such a great point, David. And what it raises for me is, so my deputy director on the center, Christina Pate, is working on a piece that we're sort of shorthand right now calling trauma-informed distance learning. And the idea is when you are an educator who's trying to serve kids either online in a synchronous way or in an asynchronous way, how do you create these conditions of success? And how do you make sure that the learning that you're offering to students is provided to them, is offered to them in a way that is accessible and is sort of compassionate about the various different conditions that kids may be existing in? And as we've been having this conversation about like the practical strategies of how do you start a lesson, right? Like how do you start that moment in a classroom? I think it really is just pointing to effective practices around conditions of learning. And so when we talk about what it looks like going back, I hope we hold on to those things, right? I hope we hold on to not just starting the classroom with, open your book to chapter 14, but really taking a moment to give students the opportunity to get settled, get regulated, think about what's coming, provide their feedback, engage with the learning in different ways, engage with their with their colleagues in the classroom, with their teachers and so on. That's like sort of the more specific, smaller piece that I think can help ease kids back into the transition into the school building and remind them about what's precious about their school and remind them of all those little indicators that the adults around them really care about them.
Absolutely. And if I may, I think like when we're looking at this notion of our system, one of the things that's been so I think beneficial, I think, is what we're looking at now is that we're trying to help people understand that everybody has a part to play in getting something done. And our schools are the first experiences, the first institutionalized experience that most of our young people have in society, right? It's the first place where people teach them from a societal kind of context. How are we going to interact? How are we going to build community? What are our values? And so, you know, as we came into this pandemic, we had teachers going on strike. We had state's departments of education really talking about what is the role that teachers play in our society, in our communities. And I just want to really talk about for briefly, right? So we have doctors who are healers. Our doctors are doing the things that they've been asked to do, which is put their lives on the line to provide healing. And our teachers are providing knowledge and education and models of what our future generations should be. And so I think that's just the one thing I really want us to ground ourselves on. What are we doing in our education system in this time of crisis vis-a-vis everybody else? And what does this mean when we reopen vis-a-vis the larger systems of our society?
I'm going to put a bug in your ears as we move into our last couple of comments about, and you've hit on it somewhat, what do you really want to see us take away from this? What might be new or innovative or new partnerships? One thing that has struck me in one of the comments was one attendee said they think that their parent engagement may have actually increased during this time. And it reminds me of when I was a principal, I was trying to figure out when should we schedule the back to school meeting or you know, donuts with dads or whatever have you to accommodate schedules. And now we're not asking about schedules. We're just trying to find people where we can, and also recognizing that some kids are in a home space that really facilitates the learning experience and some aren't. And I think we're more cognizant of how they bring that into learning. And so I'm excited that we are thinking differently and I think perhaps more diversely about how we're engaging with families. For you guys, I'm curious as to where your optimism is. There have been some comments here that there's an opportunity for change. We may be able to, we may get to do things or be able to do things differently. And so I will not put anyone on the spot, but in our last couple of minutes, please share something that you're looking forward to that we've learned recently. Amanda, you want to go?
Absolutely. One of our philosophies at Clark is also we really push on the learning outside of the classroom. What can be done outside of the four walls and the opportunities that are there for us. So I can see that when things start to go back to normalcy, I can really see that growing in a way because the teachers have had the opportunity to see some of the new tools that are out there for them to utilize. One of the activities that I'm sharing with teachers for them to share with students are a lot of virtual field trips. You know, I believe you don't have to have a paper and a pencil in front of you. You can learn in so many different ways besides that. So, you know, experiencing things that they've never experienced before through these virtual field trips, for example. Where do I see us going is I see great things happening. I see us moving towards allowing teachers to teach as they did before state testing occurred. That's where I see us right now. And as we continue, right now we're still, we are not closed yet for the entire school year at this point in Cleveland. And we don't know at this point where that's leading. We should know more information this week. But I think it gives teachers the opportunity to, not that they ever lost it, but to add more creativity to the lessons and really enjoy being a teacher at this point.
Thanks, Amanda. Natalie?
There-
Was someone about to chime in?
Oh, go ahead, Natalie.
Oh, okay. You know, I think I see the time, and I think just in one sentence, what I'm optimistic about and hope we carry forward is this openness and compassion that I'm seeing among the adults right now in terms of our flexibility with needing different ways of work, welcoming like the giggling children and the puppy barking and all of those things into our spaces. I think that really is very much like genuine, fundamental, whole person approaches to our lives and to our work, and I really hope that continues. So.
There are two things that I really have been inspired by. One is just the enthusiasm of the teachers and how fast they were able to turn everything. And I think that, you know, our students and teachers are the heart of our district. And the fact that they embraced it so well, I think just tells me about the care that they have. And Natalie mentioned this earlier, that connection, our teachers are struggling too because they don't have their kids with them. So I just think that enthusiasm of the teachers. And the other thing is just the way the entire community has come together in collaboration from all the district area, you know, leaders to the community leaders. I think it's just really been great. And I saw in the Q&A questions about how do we work with social services on our students or the city. Just reach out. That's what we did. We just started, we saw a need, we started calling and people respond. And I think that that's just been phenomenal. And I hope that that kind of responsiveness to schools and students continues.
Gene, I'm just going to take this briefly. So I have this thought experiment every now and then, right? I think to myself, you know, if we go out to like Alpha Centauri, what are the roles that we'll need to build that new society, right? Like, what are the vocations that we'll need to seat on that ship so that we reproduce our country or our society? And I've never had this thought experiment that didn't include the role of educators. And so the role of educators, I think for now is not necessarily about math, science, reading. It's about understanding the learning process of math, science, and reading, right? And so I think as parents are now understanding that knowing 2 + 2 is not the same as teaching 2 + 2 to your child, we're going to have an opportunity to reinvest in our educators and reinvest in our system of education and reinvest in our teachers, understanding the notion of focusing on that learning process includes all the things that we've talked about today. And that's what's going to make our future on Alpha Centauri good to go.
David, thank you for closing on that. And as a final note, I just want to say thank you to all of you. Your work, I think, two things I'll say. One is that as leaders, you exemplify what it means to engage parents and students and the community in this endeavor of education. And in technical and in adaptive ways, you're codifying what it means to respond to whole people, to bring this research that is so essential on how students develop, on how relationships are at the core of our learning. And I would invite those of you who are attending and viewing to take a look at San Antonio Independent School District, Cleveland Metropolitan, the work that Natalie's leading at West Ed and the work that David is leading at the Urban Assembly as models. We'll be sharing these resources and some of the citations that we've discussed in the conversation today on the Aspen site and through our Twitter feed in the days to come. But again, for the four of you, I can't thank you enough. Please stay well and take care of yourselves, and we'll be talking again soon. Bye, everybody.